Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for being here today with us. Me and Zoya are here to talk about a little bit about what is inclusive design and especially what is compassion from a Buddhist perspective, since we are both practitioners, but more about how this has entangled in our education as inclusive designers, and how during our masters and while we've been working together and doing our own theses or MRP projects, we have understood how these two subjects are interconnected. How compassion in all its textures is deeply rooted in all the methodology and the theory that is in inclusive design. So I'll start by introducing myself for those who don't know me. I'm Tania Villalobos. I've recently finished my master in inclusive design in OCAD University in Toronto, together with Zoya. And one of my interests was introducing compassion in the process of designing in the health sector. And now I'll leave you, Zoya, to introduce yourself, to talk a little bit more.
Thanks, Tania. I'm Zoya, and like Tania, I just finished the Master's in Inclusive Design at OCAD University. I spent 10 years as a graphic designer and art director, and I went into inclusive design to find a way to incorporate more social impact into my work as a designer. And my interest there, what came out of my 2 years was basically spending a lot of time looking at how to introduce creativity and creative thinking into areas that don't necessarily allow it. And so I focused a lot on the Caribbean, where I'm born and raised. And yeah, that just kind of sparked a whole new project.
Yeah, so like we were talking recently, me and Zoya, we decided to do this conversation because it was one that started, like the post said, 2 years ago, when we started understanding what was inclusive design. We started sharing and comparing ideas of what was compassion, like it's in its root, in its theoretical root, especially from a perspective of the Buddhism theology. And we started realizing that where we were hearing our teachers talk, it was basically the same thing. And that is why we decided to start this topic with this conversation. So I would like just to talk about a little bit what is compassion, and then I'll leave Zoya to define what is inclusive design. So maybe we can start by seeing its differences and its similarities.
Yeah.
So I would like to first quote Christina Feldman, which she's a neuroscientist, and she's been working in the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, the Center in Stanford University. So there, together with Dr. James Doty, she defines compassion as a multi-textural response to pain, sorrow, and anguish that includes kindness, empathy, generosity, and acceptance. The strands of courage, tolerance, equanimity are equally woven into the cloth of compassion. And above all, compassion is the capacity to open to the reality of suffering and to aspire to its healing. Some other, going more into the Buddhism practitioners, like one view of the Mahayana Buddhism is deeply rooted in compassion, which it's the reason of its theology, or the root of it, is aspiring to have enlightenment in beneficial for all the sentient beings. So the essence of compassion is love, but love as a verb, as taking action to recognize the physical, material, and psychological suffering of others, and put yourself in the skin of the other and try to heal it. Yeah. So that is like from one perspective, the compassion. I don't know, Zoya, what do you think about this, and what is like inclusive design, and how does it interrelate?
I want to touch on two things. So first, what you were saying about compassion is like spot on. It's basically the way that we understand it in Buddhism is feeling with and through something with someone else. And if we were to go deeper into the Buddhism like whole, it's this practice of abandoning your self-cherishing and exchanging self with others. Like you give up power so that you can help others. It's not about that. It's not about controlling others or a situation, but being with them through it. And then in practicing, we talk a lot about generating bodhicitta. Mm-hmm. That, yeah. Which, should I explain that?
Yeah.
Bodhicitta is a spontaneous wish to attain enlightenment, motivated by great compassion for all sentient beings. And with it is accompanied the falling away of the attachment or the illusion of an inherently existing self, basically. Because I am you and you are me, basically. And then with inclusive design is like, well, we define it in our education as a methodology that considers the full range of human diversity with respect to ability, language, culture, gender, age, race, any form of human difference. So as inclusive designers, we are looking for any pockets of society that has any kind of exclusion, and we are motivated to design or redesign that product, system, or service for more inclusion, basically.
Yes, so it seems like in that definition, the interesting part is like how to do this, right? How do we design with compassion, meaning exchanging ourselves for mm-hmm. others? And in inclusive design is like with respect for all the diversity. Mm-hmm. So that was for me like very interesting to learn these methodologies that were inclusive, and like the way it is translated to design, the compassion part and what you're talking about was in co-design or designing with and for a community, understanding that that it is impossible, like where compassion tell us that you can exchange yourself for other. When you need to design for others, we truly understand and have the humility to understand that we are not in their feet 100%. Mm-hmm. So we need to moderate our voice and put them in charge and acknowledge their experience and their knowledge in certain circumstances, or for designing a service or a product, giving space for the user's knowledge mm-hmm. and designing with them. So that's like how I would unify this compassion and inclusiveness. It's through the process where you can find these very interesting entanglements.
Yeah. So in terms of process, one that I like to use is empathy building, and we can use a process called design thinking. So I use that a lot in my research, and design thinking is essentially it's an iterative process of finding problems and trying to uncover the solution from the point of view of the user. So the 5-step process is define, empathize, ideate, prototype, and then evaluate. So I really like this process because I find, in my research that it's very accessible and it can be applied to so many things. So like even non-designers can adopt it if you teach it to them. So they have the ability to feel like they too can be inclusive within their design, even though they're not designers. I think it's really powerful to give people that agency, but just by giving them a tool that they can work with and they can do just about anything with.
Yeah, so in my case, talking about methodologies, while I was researching what methodologies were inclusive in the area of health, and we need to understand, like, especially I was my research was based here in Mexico, so I had to understand like a lot of or implement a lot of system thinking into it, and I believe that one compassionate perspective in the area of design is system thinking and understanding that it's like a translation again of this putting yourself in the other shoes. But when you brought it up into a whole system that can be a hospital or a school, then you need to see the perspective or all the users or all the staff, all the family members, everybody that is involved in the system, and that starts to be complicated, right? Yeah. So that's why I think theory is very important. So, like you say, design thinking is really super important. And in my case, I used experience-based co-design, EBCD, which was really, really interesting to see how they interlap and they take a lot of importance in emotions. Mm-hmm. So there's this really interesting book, or where I think the experience-based co-design is really well explained and put into practice, which is bringing user experience into the health improvement by Paul Bate and Glenn Robert. And what they explain is like it in no way, and I think that has to be said in any participatory design or co-design, in no way you want the user to become an expert designer.
Right.
It means more like giving access to the designer about the user, all the experience that the user is having. Yeah. But not only through like a brief, but really inviting the user in becoming part of the designer. And sometimes when talking about marginalized communities, make them lead the project, right? So for the health sector, experience-based co-design has had a lot of very well results, because it enables the users, in this case they can be patients, and the staff, which in my case were nurses, they are able to design together and be part or create, and also sometimes even ask the questions. Mm-hmm. Like, what is missing and who is missing in this part? Like to start that conversation with the user and continue, like you said, in the process of when you start a prototype, to evaluate it, constantly ask yourself who is missing, what is missing, and as designers, never get rigid or never get too attached to any prototype or any design, because that won't benefit the whole project or the user. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, because you're just the facilitator, not the controller. And that just loops right back around to compassion, and how to affect real change, you don't need power, you need compassion. You exchange yourself with the others. When you give up power, then you actually have it. When you try to have power, you don't have it. So
that's exactly like in my beginning as a graphic designer, as a communicator, I struggled with this. Like I say it, and I am still struggling. It seems like I'm constantly in this place where I need to defend sometimes what I've done, and I sometimes feel like it's a part of me, and detaching from that can become quite a problem sometimes. And what I think that sometimes is like, what helps sometimes is like, and I heard this in a talk from Jutta Treviranus, that is the director of the Institute, the Inclusive Research Center. She said that always include your users from the start, before you get, like, not just to evaluate a prototype later on, but from the beginning. And I think that that's a way to, from the beginning, loosen up and don't fall into hierarchy.
Yeah.
Right?
Do you think, I'm going to just throw a question in here.
Please do.
Do you think that that is a possible limitation of visual communication or graphic design? Because coming from a graphic design background, now I'm very efficient in communication, so forth. But sometimes change requires more than communication. Like, and in a commercial sense, in the role of the graphic designer, we can be so far removed from the social problem that we don't have that ability to maybe impact. And in a way, the having to defend oneself, like, or defend the work, it almost seems like that might be just a limitation of the discipline. I'm not sure yet how graphic design cannot be that way.
Yeah, for sure. I was thinking while you were asking this question, you in the beginning were saying how part of compassion is accepting that there's not an intrinsic identity in anything.
Yeah.
So that is not something we are learning with graphic design school. So then even our teacher starts telling us, like, this typography is bad. This typography is not nice. Or we start like adding subjective or adjectives to things, and this can apply to anything. Like, I don't want to get into any topic of racism or everything, but we do. We label things. Mm-hmm. And as graphic designers, we are taught to become maybe sometimes more judgers, or we start like judging based on our eye, or only on one sense, which is the visual one in our as graphic designers. Yeah. And then we forget that there is that is relative to the mind that is experiencing it, right?
Yeah.
For me, that typography from a Mexican woman, from that with a background in design, might be a typography that has this or that, but that adjective is not anywhere in the intrinsic identity of any design.
Yeah, because it doesn't inherently exist.
It doesn't exist.
Which is the emptiness of
everything.
That's the phenomena of life. Nothing inherently exists. Yeah,
exactly. So if I design that way rigidly and get attached to any of my designs, then I'm not becoming this compassionate facilitator of knowledge and experience.
Yes.
So I think that in that way is the practice that as designers we should have in empowering the users, empowering the community we are working with. Maybe it's indigenous people. Then do we always see them as collaborators, or do we see them as we are teaching them? Or like patients, sometimes in what I came across doing design in a hospital, the patriarchy way of doing medicine sometimes doesn't give much space for change, or for you listening how the patient or the user is experiencing the things.
Yeah.
So that brings me back to the experience-based co-design, which I was saying, that is really rooted into emotions, and it provides in its methodology the uses of touch points that are emotional entanglements, or where the user has interacts with the design emotionally, and to analyze that throughout its journey, to really put yourself in others. Like that's not how it's explained in the textbook, but it could be maybe like a Buddhism design, if you put it that way, without even knowing, right?
Yeah, that's very, very profound. It is. I think I still am trying to figure out myself, my day-to-day creative practice, the balance. Maybe it is just a balancing act of how do I design to lead, like design because I am the designer within a visual communication sense, but allowing others to lead that design because as designers, like as graphic designers, a lot of people who are not graphic designers like to tell us how to design and then it doesn't quite look right. So that's a balancing act that I'm still trying to figure out. But one of the most interesting things I think in my creative practice right now is that because I work within publishing and I work on books, I have the challenge in front of me as well. Maybe it's an opportunity, not just challenge, but to learn how to be more inclusive within visual representation. And that's everything from not just having the right physical representation of person to a community, but how I go about the process of including those people and bring them into the fold, into this whole other world, to tell the appropriate story. And it's a real challenge when you meet systems that are like robust and already existing, and you have to try to slow that system down to get it to work more inclusively and more holistically. But hopefully I will figure it out.
No, for sure you will. And on that subject, and one thing that I find that is like interesting is that, like, talking about those kind of systems, I think that something that helped me a lot and in my research and was having that vocabulary to name it and to understand it, right? So sometimes, like, when we start a project that is inclusive and that we want to use inclusive methodologies, and if it will be with a client or it's just our research, and when we are talking to the users and the community we want to represent or work with, I think that the correct terminology, or I think that's where I found more help in thus creating those, like, or slowing down those robust systems that
Right.
sometimes already have some marginalizing problems that they can be even or very, very profound or just very subtle.
Mm-hmm.
So what in the beginning, what worked for me was having the correct, like, vocabulary and explaining it in a sense that it was like in my case that I was talking working with children and nurses.
Yeah.
So it was like a two-way vocabulary, but I did not want it to divide it. I wanted it to be the same, like the same way I talk to the children, talk to the nurses. So this comes to my second point that I wanted to make about this. So one of my area of opportunity was that I was not led by the ethics board, by the REV, interact with the children. And at the beginning, again, I reacted in this sort of way that why am I not allowed to if I am a researcher or whatever?
Right.
And it was like one of the most and the best, I think, teachings I have had was to understand the importance of a multidisciplinary team.
Yeah.
Well, I did have to work with a psychologist because I was not the expert in emotions or handling deep emotions that could arise in whenever we are doing participatory design or co-design or whatever ethnographic research we're doing that involves working with communities that are endangered or are in whatever way have been previously marginalized or whatever. So that was one thing that was important for me, like taking experts into your team and understanding that for sure in the first workshop, working with collaborating with children, I realized that I would have not done it correct. Like I would start my like designer point of view, and so I think that was like a big lesson for me. And it was good that they shut me up and say you can't talk about it perfect. I think for the best of the research to put me in a corner and say you just observe, and that was like I think that inclusive design taught me is like just observe. That's and I struggled in the beginning, and then I was so relieved, and it was beautiful to see. For me to teach the psychologist was inclusive design, and for her to teach me, and then the children share us their experience, and then design together. And that was something that I was really happy to learn, and still learning. And I think it's a struggle because sometimes it's hard to let go. For me.
So that's going deeper into your compassion.
Yeah, for sure.
So is that what you say that's what drives you socially? Like, what are your, branching on from that, like what are your values and your interests? I want deeper insight into like you and the type of work that you want to do moving forward after this project you've done.
For me, what attracted me, to be very honest, I really wanted to see communication, compassion, and crisis. Like in that state of crisis, like I was really driven down on, like, of course, compassion is important and whatever. But what about when you are sharing the suffering of thousands, like is the cases of nurses or doctors, of health practitioners? Like now in this pandemic, we see it every day. They are in an emotional crisis every day. So I really wanted to see that in action. Why? Because to understand, to being able to understand it, to understand how compassion and communication was, first of all, to see it, to understand it in action, which was why I was driven to the oncology pediatric ward. And that was one. So I think I do want to do more experience-based co-design here in Mexico, because from my knowledge, this was the first one that has been done in an academic way. Cool. For sure, but it was like a very superficial, like, so I think we could go deeper into this practice. And maybe not that I only want to concentrate in the health sector, but I am really deeply moved by the people that work in crisis situations, and how communication and compassion entangle there, what happens, what arises, and how this systematic thinking works there. Like it's a whole system there. We have many things, and where I focus my research or my energy is in the emotions that arises.
Yeah.
Which this is not me. This is experience-based co-design. Like that's exactly what has been done in the past, and that for me is really interesting, because emotions. It's like a way of understanding what makes us human in a way, right?
Yeah.
Like humanity in us, and how we interact in that. Yeah. And the crisis is like where we can see them changing fastly.
Yeah.
So that's me. But I wanted to ask you about post-colonialism and your research in the Caribbean, and how was how did you use all this empathy in your research working in education, which is like, I'm so deeply into health, but you're in education, so
yeah. So how do I answer this? I think it starts with my personal values and interests, which, if I had to bring it down to like two things, I would say it's authenticity and courage. I think I can do many things, but if I'm not abiding in the space of authenticity and courage, then I'm out of alignment with my best self. And that's like all I ever try to do, is just be my best self. So in inclusive design, because we were in this program, I'm applying the authenticity and the courage to my work, because the way I see it is, for me, I'm researching, I'm writing, I'm designing about things or social causes that feel right to me, and that maybe in some way require me to do the unpopular. So throughout this process, I came to discover that I am kind of a decolonizing designer, which I never thought I would be. I started the MRP process trying to do something that seemed interesting, but it didn't feel right. So I was like super confused, and then like super stressed, because like everybody had their idea and I didn't have mine, and I didn't know what I was going to do. And it seemed on the surface that it was cool, but I knew for me it didn't feel right. It didn't feel like I was doing something that required me to be bigger than who I am. I didn't have to step back and allow something bigger than myself. And so when I finally stumbled on my project, which is unlocking creativity in the Caribbean and bringing creative thinking into education, I went about it in a way that I thought like I could just create a space for creativity. And then, because of inclusive design is so rich in the research that we have to do and how deep we have to go, I realized in examining the education system that I was brought up in, that I couldn't do that without decolonization. And I had zero interest in decolonization. I had zero interest in anything of that kind, because I just thought it was going to be like so much theory that I have to go through and all this stuff, that it's just like, to even understand where we're at now requires an in-depth research of so much history. And I just thought that was going to be like way too much work. But I couldn't do it without decolonization. It was just like smack in my face. So I had to get myself out of the way and exchange myself with the other, and which is the rise of my more compassionate mind. And I had to try and problem solve, how to bring more creative thinking into a space that is so creative but doesn't produce creative like opportunities. And that is the nexus of post-colonial society. So it was a really nice discovery for me, because decolonization is inherently inclusive, whereas colonization is exclusive. Exactly. So it's very interesting to me how my project turned out, how I was able to use a design thinking process and work it into a toolkit that potential teachers and students can use just to generate creativity or creative thinking in their own way, in their own time, without conditions, but how they see best for themselves. And and also able to, in a way, platform a lot of the history that isn't really known. I think, you know, being from the Caribbean and not living there right now, it's a place that's very much like, it's like the perfect vacation destination for everyone. but that's just like, it's like a hashtag, I live where you vacation. This is an actual thing. But that's just like one layer. And I think that it's so important that people do the work to show that this is a multifaceted place with many, many layers. And while you can see it as just a vacation destination, there's so much more here that there's not only to offer, but to be uncovered and to improve, like everywhere in the world. And so for me, like moving forward, I'm not necessarily stuck to education. I think education is super, super important, because when you look at industries worldwide, like there's the lag time, like the lag time for an iPhone is like, I don't know, 9 months. I don't know when they come up with a new one, like every year or something. But the lag time for education, not just in the Caribbean, but anywhere, is 50 years. So that's how long. So like so many generations go through an education system before it gets reformed. Yeah. And that's why there's so many people that get lost and it doesn't work. So I think that it's just super important to pay attention to a space that has that issue, but also thinking within the Caribbean context, what I was kind of proud of that I didn't know when I started, but I feel proud now, is that when I was working with my advisors in the Caribbean, you know, they said to me, the problem with the Caribbean is that we don't have the research for the education space, like a scholarly work in an academic sense. Mm-hmm. It's as I was saying, an unpopular subject, right? Mm-hmm. It's not cool or sexy at all. So if you went to scholarly research for the Caribbean, you'd find so much on history, like so much on economics and all these kind of things, but education doesn't really have that volume of work. And so I felt I was really pleased that I was contributing to that space. And it's kind of given me a new motivation moving forward to do something in my life that's like bigger than me. So no one might ever read it until like I'm dead, but someday there will be like a body of work that I contributed to for a very important set of people.
I'm sure it is. So I was thinking that maybe because of the time we can answer some questions. I loved how you wrapped that up. And I think we covered the topics that we wanted to share tonight. And so what about answering some questions? Monse, do you have them, or do you?
Yes. I have one that it's, if you can give us an example of a process in inclusive design. Like I know that the minority you are designing for have to be part of all the process and all the creation, but how you do that?
Well, we can go a little. Zoya described design thinking, and I described experience-based co-design. I could do it like more quickly, maybe more like in the steps. So just when we talk about inclusive process, there are many that are inclusive, and I think, and you will correct me, Zoya, the meaning of that is when designing, include the community you are working with as designers. So this means that if I'm designing for older people, maybe I'm designing something that is for the community of elderly people, I include them in my design process. this is in my research. I will not be just like a researcher, and there will be the researchers. Like there won't be that division. We will work together.
Yeah.
No, and there are many ways of doing this. Like they could start from the beginning of the research. They could even be the researchers themselves of what they need. And like Zoya said, we become facilitators of that.
Yeah.
And that is the meaning of participatory design or co-design. What I understand is that all of these are like children, or they all come from ethnography. Like no one created like a black line or anything. The inclusive part was in the part of including them in the designer. But the research processes are based on ethnography from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And then in the one that I used or are more familiar with, that is experience-based co-design, the steps are when you do the research, you add this, you engage with the users and staffs. In this case, this is how it was, the theory of how it can be implemented in the health sector. So when designing for health, you not only include the patients, but also the staff in a system way of thinking. And they will become with you, the researchers and the designers. Mm-hmm. And emphasize, it's not that we like in my case that I worked with children, I didn't have to make them designers, but with tools or workshops where they could draw, and in conversations they could be open-ended or not, or very relaxed conversations, they start to design. And then a prototype is done, and what is very, very important is that they have to evaluate the prototype, and they are the ones that evaluate it and correct it, and then I don't know what you want to add to this. So what do you think of my answer?
No, I thought your answer was spot on. I don't have anything to add to it. It was really good.
Yeah, like maybe, yeah. So it's like designing with and for a community.
Yeah, yeah.
Also, if there is a product or an object or a campaign, visual campaign that you can refer to, that it's like a case of success of inclusive design, so we can have like an example for it. You told me about the ramp.
Yeah, that is a super common, and I don't think like everybody can think of it in their mind. Mm-hmm. That is true, and me and Zoya were thinking today about exercises. So one simple way of understanding is that, well, the way we've been taught in our classes is that, you know, if because of marketing and everything and these theories that always told us to design thinking for the majority, and the majority calculating it in clusters would be like the 80% of the population, what they need. But this means that you're leaving 20% out of it. So normally, as some, not all, but some designers do their work or design is thinking, starting from that 80%. And a way of designing inclusively would be designing far, 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 far from the least represented people, or the people that can not use your design. And that is something that is important. Like when you test your prototype, don't test it with the people that are comfortable or are represented. You use with the people that are more challenged, and there's where innovation is. So in an exercise, an example would be the ramp that was intended for wheelchairs. But then, so you start designing for the people that have less access to a street, maybe. But when you think of that ramp, then that ramp not only benefits the elderly or the people that are in wheelchairs, also the women that or men that are with cradle, or people that have problems in their knees but are not necessarily in a wheelchair, or people that are overweight. Or so when you design from far back and think of the person that would be more complicated in a design, it will benefit all.
Yeah.
And a way to understanding is that today if it is that we are in a point of privilege and we are part of this 80%, that's not guaranteed, and I'm sad to say it, that we won't be in any day part of the 20%. So that design will last longer if it is thought for the most marginalized people, or the persons or individuals that will have more problems interacting with your design.
Yeah, I'll just add to that another example that I commonly use, which is a more, I think, organic to inclusive design example, is like closed captioning, basically, which started for audible reasons, but now like we're going to be able to use it for translation on this session for the language translation. And that's just a very like small example of a design that's more inclusive, that started for one thing, but it can spread to many, 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 many other users.
Thank you. Also, Andrea Flores asked Zoya about your project. It's for education. It's a research project, but it has a final product. Or what's the last objective?
Yeah. So my project is, you can find it online at thisiscontexture.com. And it's an education project where I worked with a group of teachers at a school in Barbados to design a toolkit that involves design thinking that they could use in classroom sessions. And so the final product, it's the toolkit, which is downloadable, and you can use it for you can test it if you would like. And it has two parts, a manual and activity cards. Yeah, that's basically it.
Releasing control of the design process is a hard thing to convince people to. In our individualistic society, it's natural to want the power, to ensure that your work reflects well on you as a person. Especially in the corporate environment, companies have trouble playing the role of facilitator and withholding judgment. The profit motivation is always judgmental. Are there ways you, Tania, in your work with Zoya, and you, Zoya, in your work at HarperCollins, have found success in helping others reduce the role their ego plays in the design process? How they can design with less judgment and with more emphasis on elevating the experience of the user?
It's very, very, it's challenging. I found that my personality is quite pragmatic and I tend to be objective by nature. So maybe for me, it's been a little bit easier, but I have found that over the years in my 10-year career so far, the newer designers and the younger designers are much more attached. And then as you get more experience, you give up more control. I think that one way to motivate them to give up control, I have found, is creating a feedback loop for them. So what I mean by that is engaging them in showing their work to the non-designers or to the users more than they would like to, because sometimes, like, as designers, which is an artistic practice, we can like want to get it perfect and you can like spend forever on it. But I have found that to engage them in showing their work, to get constructive criticism as much as possible and continuously, then they start to see more like what is working and then what is just their interpretation or their personal projection onto the work. How do I help people reduce their ego? That's really hard, but sometimes it happens. throughout the process? I don't know about you, Tania. What do you think?
Well, I think I'm gonna say something obvious and maybe a cliche, but it has worked. Like by starting by an example, like starting with you, like with me, that is not hard, lowering my ego for starts, right? So if in the beginning I don't put myself like I have all the knowledge, but then including the client as part of the process as well, like because we have had like some runs on inclusive design projects in Zoya, like very briefly, we were just starting. So when we have a social project or we're researching something like that, then you start by yourself lowering down your ego and saying, like, this is like an adventure, but whatever may arise will arise, and we will not get tightened by the process, right? So me as a designer might feel uncomfortable with what the user needs, and you as a client also. But if we get in this like if we get into this adventure together and compromise and really put forward or believe that the user comes first, then this is something that will happen. So I guess that would be more like a filter. The client from the beginning will tighten up, and start talking weird and say like, what do you mean? Like, and then you will see that might be a client that will have more difficulty in sharing the power with the user. But if you react in the same way, then he'll feel more defensive, right? But sometimes I tell in Zoya when we talk about that sometimes designing is like psychology. Like you have to juggle many things. But with the example, and also when the people that design with us, the other designers that are designing in team together with me, if they see me react like that, they will react the same way. As Zoya says, when you're younger, and I was, and I am still, that it's hard to release that. And because you get attached to your design, and having compassion to yourself and the client and the others that are designing, and then you say this will be hard for all of us, but in the beginning, where are we? What are we doing? What is the purpose of this project again? So it will be like defining a goal and then really committing to it. And if it is to represent something else, and there will be, and there are, and there will be sometimes where a product or a service that is high, as these graphic designers, we are hired, and the client won't design, and you have to be compassionate too and say that doesn't mean he's bad or not inclusive. It's just that it is, and you can decide if you engage with it or not, or if you engage how, and what are your limitations as a designer or a communicator. Like in our case, maybe if we do want to become inclusive designers, then if that is the project, well, I advise to not engage if it will not be till the end.
Yeah.
That is, but if it's a graphic design project, then you may have like the chance. But if you're putting the stamp of inclusive in your project, I am a little bit radical in that, and that's I would say do it well or do not do it, because you may harm more. And if you're just like in a graphic design stage like I was, then observe, learn, and little by little you will like have the courage to say no, I will not engage in something that is not inclusive because this is my belief.
Thank you for listening to our very first Inclusive Conversations. Inclusive Conversations is produced by Manifold, an inclusive design consultancy, and you can find out more about us on our website at hellomanifold.com.